Are you ready? I'm ready. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Ed, are you ready? Cool. Welcome to our adult education time today, and to those who are watching at some point later on YouTube. It's good to have conversations about important issues, and our social ministry spotlight of this month is on immigration in lots of different ways. And I'm really delighted that Sarah is with us today. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more fully, but her life, in many ways, is impacted by the U.S. immigration system. And system is a broadly painted word. What I have included for you, one of the things that our social ministry team has really tried to focus on is what has the church had to say about these issues. And we have social statements that take tens of years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we also have, as a church, social messages, which require less approval and are more related to contemporary issues. And so what I passed out beforehand were the ELCA's social message on immigration, which dates to 1998. And was updated in 2018 to reflect the changes in U.S. policy, and on human rights. Those are overlapping issues in many ways. And so you have the text of those. I wouldn't encourage you to read them now because Sarah is way more captivating. And I thought this was a good way to help you to focus on her. So without further ado, Sarah, it's good to have you with us, and thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you very much. So, buenos dias. You're probably looking at me and seeing Salvadoran family and wondering where that connection is, because I probably don't look like your typical Salvadoran person that you are expecting to see, and that's because I am not. But I did meet my husband in El Salvador, which has let me experience lots and lots of things firsthand with the U.S. immigration system. And I know that Timuth was here earlier to speak with you about the legal aspects. So even though I feel like I could work as a paralegal in an immigration law firm at this point with everything our family has been through, I want to focus primarily on the stories of what our family has gone through. And because immigration has become such a partisan, hot touching stone right now, I think some of the things to remember is the things that our family have gone through with lots of different people in leadership from both parties. And so both parties have been guilty of not always living up to the biblical promise of welcoming the stranger. And so no one can truly hold up their head and say, well, my team is on the right side on this. Both sides have had some moments of weakness and error with that. And I think one of the other things, if you were in the 8:30 service, Pastor Chris gave a really great sermon about being willing to change your perspective. And I think one of the things that I see from social media, from family and friends who are very against letting immigrants come here, is everything that they think is happening is not really true in what you really experience going through the system. And if what they thought was happening was what was really happening, I would share their viewpoint. And so if we could just all have like some understanding of what people actually go through, I think we would find we have much more in common than what separates us on this issue. And so that's just my request, to have you some open hearts and minds as I share my story. This is all exactly what happened. So since I know you guys also travel to El Salvador, you've probably had conversations about accompaniment, and that the purpose of the sister parish relationships is to be founded on relationships. And I'm an overachiever. And so I met my husband on a mission trip. I really did a good job of building those relationships. And when I had to give a presentation, years after I first met him, was going through pictures from previous trips, I found this picture, which is like moments before I met my husband for the first time. I'm like, how many people get to have the before picture of when they meet their spouse? So we had just pulled up to visit a church there, and I'm getting something out of my purse, probably my sunblock or my bug spray. And then my husband is on, so I'm in this corner looking down with the sunglasses on, and on the far end is my husband, who was the diaconal pastor at the church, coming out of the church to welcome us. We did not really talk much like individually. I went back to Ascension and Waukesha. I mentioned this as one of the potential projects that we could, as we took baby steps. This was the very first trip that anyone from our church had taken to El Salvador. I said this could be a nice first step for us as we start to pursue what it means. And so we decided to become partners with that project, and the store opened. And so even though I had said all these other people on this El Salvador committee, they keep going back. I love to travel. This is a one and done. Well, now that this hardware store was opening up, I had to go back the next year to see what it looked like. So I went back a year later, and there I am with your Pastor Ann as we were marching in the anniversary parade. So, and then after that, we went and spent time out on the eastern part of the country where I got to spend quite a bit of time. And this time, one of our goals was to really make sure that we established friendships with the people who were working in that agroferreteria. Before, we were working with some missionaries that were there, and they were our intermediaries. They were getting ready to return to the U.S., and we thought if this is going to be a partnership, this should be between Ascension and the people in this church. Now, since Pastor Ann is here, I'll have to tell the real story of what happened, and that is that my husband now announced during our dinner there, well, Sarah, are you married? Do you have a boyfriend? I think on next year's delegation it's going to be for our wedding. And I was so taken aback. I thought, what is this man saying? Oh my goodness, this man's crazy. Well, a year later, it was for our wedding. So we ended up exchanging information because we needed to stay in touch for the church. And then we started just chatting about life, and one thing led to another. I visited there at Christmas and things along those lines, and realizing our two options were for me to quit my job. And as a teacher, once you quit your job, you don't really get it back easily once you've got a master's degree, and go to where I would have no employment opportunity, or he and I would have to get married so he could get a visa to come here. And we were at a point in life where we figured we've had enough clunkers in our lives. This probably is the real thing. And we've spent so much time talking instead of just sitting next to each other watching TV. We really know each other fairly well. So in El Salvador, we had to go through a very romantic office at a law firm in San Salvador. And so this involved 2 different embassies to get married, because we had to have a law office that was sanctioned by the U.S. Embassy that would recognize the paperwork they issued. However, El Salvador is not known as a big tourist destination for destination weddings. So you also need to have a law firm that was familiar with Salvadoran law for someone that was a non-citizen of El Salvador getting married. So we had a very romantic 9 a.m. wedding in a law office in San Salvador. We had hoped to take everyone out for a really nice lunch because his parents and Pastor Julio had taken the bus from Usulután to come out for that. And then they had to be back on the 1 o'clock bus. Unfortunately, the only restaurants open at that time of the day was the food court at the mall. So our wedding fancy luncheon was fast food at the food court. Then we followed up 2 days later. We were back at the church where he had worked in Usulután, where we had an intimate wedding for 400 of his friends and family and the members of the 4 churches he worked at. And that was one of the questions he had when he had his interview with the U.S. Embassy. Well, how many people came to your wedding? Like, how legit was this wedding? 400 people, and even the people who worked at the embassy in El Salvador were amazed at the number of people that were there. So when I came home, I was expecting our first child, and I was living on my own with our dog, and I had a very difficult pregnancy in terms of morning sickness. I had one of those experiences where I had morning sickness that lasted all day long for 5 months, and so I wasn't able to cook for myself. I couldn't wash dishes. I got sick going into the grocery store, and so my doctor was working with our immigration lawyer to get the paperwork to expedite his arrival, and we filed 2 of those. And both times we got the denial from the U.S. Embassy at 5 o'clock on a Friday. So we always were issued those emails just at a time where the law office I worked with here was closed for the weekend, and I couldn't call them and say, what do we do now? So it was always timed in a way that just felt like a little bit of a twist of cruelty, that there was nothing we could do about it. And so many of my relatives were saying to me, oh, this delay must be happening because the Salvadoran government doesn't want to let him go. And no, that was not the case at all. The Salvadoran government had zero say in this process. This was completely the U.S. government in this situation deciding what the timeline was. In spite of all that, he was able to get his visa within 9 months. And so he left home that day. He had his interview at the U.S. Embassy on Monday, bought his plane ticket on Tuesday, picked up the paperwork on Thursday, said goodbye to everyone on Friday, and got on the plane on Saturday. So he had very little time to make all of those changes. And this is a picture that Kendra from Lake Park, who's a former chair of the El Salvador Committee, took when he was at the airport. And this is him saying, "Where's my wife?" And that's because between the time that he left El Salvador, where he last had a phone, and between when he arrived in Milwaukee, I went into labor. And so he arrived at the hospital, and 5 minutes later, our first daughter was born. So he is still wearing a winter coat that my brother, who he had never met, handed him at the airport and said, "Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Ben. Here's a winter coat. My dad's taking you to the hospital. We'll get your suitcases. We'll see you more tomorrow." So he had a very interesting first arrival to the United States. With that, he had a green card for 2 years. After that, we had to pay the government over $1,000 for them to reevaluate our marriage. We had to turn in a variety of photos, activities. We were lucky because we had 2 children at this point. We have another friend that also met someone in El Salvador, and they were an older couple. They have grandchildren from previous marriages. And when they went through that 2-year process, their renewal was denied, and it was said that their marriage was thought to have been a fraud because they did not have any children. And they said, but we're kind of past that point in life where that's a possibility for us. So they had to spend an additional $1,000 to file an appeal to prove that their marriage was real, with additional affidavits from people proving we've been together with this couple. It is a real marriage. They really do love each other. They really do live life together as a family. But they need to look at all of your bank statements. They need to look at all of your utilities. And when we were trying to get Edwin's name on some of those documents, we were in this vicious cycle of, well, he needs to have his driver's license, but he doesn't have his learner's permit yet. Well, we need this to get a bank statement. Well, we need the bank statement for this. And it was a good thing I was on maternity leave when he first arrived, because we spent days just driving from office to office. Well, you have to go here. Well, no, you need this document, but they said we need this. And so it was a really difficult process. And I can only imagine, as someone who has traveled and lived as a foreigner myself prior to this experience, has a college degree, and English is my primary language, how difficult it was for me to navigate this system, and what that must be like for people who come in with that support system in place, how to figure all of that out. So our next step was planning for our 1-year anniversary. We're going to do a wedding in the United States because my family and friends were primarily unable to travel. Those 400 people were pretty much all Salvadorans. And then we were also going to have the baptism of our daughter that same weekend. My husband's father had been living in Baltimore for years and years and years, and so he was able to fly here from Baltimore. But we had hoped to have my husband's mother get a tourist visa to come to visit. She's lived apart from her husband for 30 years. He's been able to travel back and forth to El Salvador somewhat, but she has never been allowed to come and see him or her other children who lived here. So we spent the $600 of various fees. We spent lots of time putting documents together. And she went to the U.S. Embassy for her interview, and they asked her, prior to your husband's retirement, what was his job? What is your daughter-in-law's job? They said, we're not going to look at any of those documents you brought. We're denying your visa at this time. And without any explanation as to why, she had to get up at 4 a.m, drive 4 hours to get there, and then drive back home. She was denied this opportunity to come and be a part of her son's wedding. Our daughter is named after her. It was her first grandchild to be named after her, and she was not able to be there for the baptism. And again, her husband has lived here all of these years. So sadly, we had to have our wedding here with just his dad, who's on the end, and my family, and then the baptism without Grandma getting to be a part of it. And so that was our first big disappointment of that process. So we realized our next step is to help his father finally become a U.S. citizen, because that would strengthen the request from him. Now, his dad's story goes back to the 80s. So as you may know, there was a civil war going on in El Salvador in the 80s. Edwin's family had to move quite a bit. Mom had 6 children. They originally were living in a small town in a mountain, and one day the guerrillas came up and said that they really liked 2-year-old Edwin, and could they have him because they had more access to education and other things for him? Could they adopt him? At that point, Mom said, we're moving into the big town of San Rafael, where they could be a little bit safer. And so Edwin's dad was worried he was going to be drafted to fight in the war, so he came to the U.S. undocumented at that time. In 1986, Ronald Reagan recognized that what was happening with the immigration system wasn't working. So he granted a mass amnesty at that time, giving permanent residency to people who were living here. So at that time in 1986, my father-in-law was granted the rights to become a permanent resident of having 2 of his brothers live with us for a while. And one day the 3 of them put on their coats and they said, oh, we're running into Milwaukee. And my husband said, could I have $100? Yes, but where are you going that you need $100? Oh, we've got an interview to talk about my dad's citizenship things. So where did you find this lawyer? Oh, we're sure he's really good. We heard a commercial for him on the radio. And so we know he's a good lawyer because he was on the radio and they spoke Spanish, and he just needs $300, so we're each going to chip in $100. I said, wait a minute. We have this really good lawyer that we worked with for your immigration process that Catholic Charities recommended. They were very honest. I said, here's what I suggest. Why don't you call the law firm that we already work with, that we know they're really good and honest, see what kind of proposals they set up for you. And if you're not happy, you can go to the one you found on the radio. I said, but typically we all know you never go to a lawyer that you hear on the radio or TV. Really? I said, no. And so then they called our lawyer, and he did the first step of this process. He said, oh, I can do that for you guys for free. I'm happy to help out. Which then that was their first life lesson of, oh, there's a different way than just what we've all told each other within our own immigrant community of how to survive. And so one of the things that we asked, that the lawyer suggested that we do, is try to find this initial filing for immigration for my husband's mother and his siblings, because they had all applied to come to the U.S. in the 80s, and that would have put them at the front of the line that we always hear about, because that paperwork would have been turned in. Unfortunately, there was no record of that, so we had to refile for his siblings that were in El Salvador to come here. And right now they are processing people from, I think we looked it up last, 3 weeks ago, I think we're at 2007. So if you filed your paperwork in 2007, you are getting an interview sometime in this year. And so we went through the process to have his dad become a citizen first, because that was going to be the strongest application. And then we received notice that he qualified to become a U.S. citizen, had met all the requirements, but they were withholding judgment at this time. And that document didn't tell us why they were withholding judgment. About 2 months later, we received notice. And the notice said, since you have retired, you've been spending a lot of time in El Salvador. So we doubt your decision to really be a full resident and citizen of the United States. So we had to then refile the paperwork with more fees to the U.S. Homeland Security Office, as well as some more legal fees, with paperwork saying his wife lives in El Salvador and she is not allowed to come to the United States. And so if he wishes to spend any time with his wife, he can only do that the 6 months out of the year that his residency permit allows him to be out of the U.S. But if his wife is ever allowed to come to the U.S., he'll be here more often, but he also would like to honor his marriage vows. And fortunately, with that, we were able to get that decision reversed. And as you can see, he was able to become a U.S. citizen. So that was a really exciting day for the family to have the first U.S. citizen in the Aparicio family. My husband did also become a U.S. citizen 2 years ago now. So this brings us to the next person in our family that had immigration problems that we needed to help with. And right next, my husband's in the middle. The man right next to him is his brother, Carlos. and that is his family with him at our wedding in El Salvador. And Carlos's job in El Salvador was working for the cable internet services as their bill collector. And so he had a motorbike they gave him, and he went from home to home on the motorbike collecting people's payments for their internet and their cable. That is not the safest job to have in El Salvador, to be driving around on a bike when everyone knows that you are carrying bags of cash with you. And so the gangs quickly figured out that was his job. They could also see that he has some tall boys and some big boys, and Carlos himself, by Central American standards, is not a small man. Central Americans tend to be shorter in stature than we are, and he's as tall as my brothers, who are 6 feet tall. And so when the gangs target the parents in a family, it's because they want to target the parents, but it's also they want to get the dads out of the way to make the sons vulnerable. And so the gang started following him at gunpoint, robbing him once a week, showing up at their home. They had to leave the house that their family owned and move in with my mother-in-law because it was in a more populated area and a little bit safer. It finally got to the point, even though Carlos was saying, I'm doing everything you want, I've quit my job, I'm not going to testify, just please leave my family. They still continue to threaten the boys and show up and sneak notes under the door and things along those lines. So he made the difficult decision that he needed to come to the United States, and he came on his own. So he was one of the brothers that was actually living with us when we went through this. So he, at that point, the only way to get asylum, as it once again is now, is to cross through Mexico and cross the border. So he did that first. Then in April 2016, we took a delegation to El Salvador with Ascension. And these are my nieces and nephews that are there. And the gangs in El Salvador, I've described them to people when we want to travel there, are a lot like cockroaches. When cockroaches see the light, they scatter away and you don't see them and you don't know they're there. And when a delegation from the U.S. goes to visit, the light reflecting off of our pale skin is like the light that makes all of those cockroaches and their gangs go away. We don't have to deal with any of even the petty theft. We don't see the problems. The gang members want nothing to do with us because the police do the best they can to keep up with the crime, but there's so much crime against the poor citizens of the country, they can't keep up with it all. But if something happens to a citizen coming from the United States, that's going to be priority number one for the police department, and no one wants to deal with that kind of problem. So we're very safe when we're down there. But on this trip, I started to feel a little that I could see stuff going on. For example, there was a day where my husband split off from the delegation to go visit his grandma, and the gangs had checkpoints around the village where she lived, where you had to check in with the gang to go past that point to receive permission to visit your family who lived there. And because they knew Edwin and knew he worked with the church, they allowed him to go past that point. We wouldn't have seen that point if we had been there with the delegation, but since Edwin was there without us, he had to go through that. Prior to that visit, my sister-in-law had asked us to consider adopting her oldest son. And I'm sorry, this is very emotional. I had said no initially because I knew how much she loved her son. And she had had a very difficult life as an orphan child herself, and so her firstborn son was her precious child. And I said, let's do what we can to get them here legally so we can do this. But on that trip, I realized we need to get him out of here. And so we came back. I worked with some of the best lawyers in Atlanta and Boston, spending $150 a minute with lawyers to try to help us figure out how to do this. And they all said, there's no way. You cannot adopt him. The only thing he can do right now is get to the United States border and turn himself in. And so sadly, that's what that family had to do. So my sister-in-law, with my 14-year-old, he was 13 at that time, 13-year-old nephew and the two little kids, had to come up through Mexico, cross the river, and turn themselves in. Because at that point, that was the only legal way to come to the United States to get to political asylum, which it is again. When the crisis was starting after they arrived, and for about a year, Obama did set up a system where you could apply at the U.S. Embassy in your country to see if you had credible fear to stop that journey, because the people who make all the money on that are the drug cartels. And so it was trying to take some money out of the pockets of those people. But they arrived. They stayed at a detention center in Dilley, Texas. So we found an immigration lawyer that could hopefully at least visit. So when they had their court appearance to see if there was a credible fear, that she would at least have a lawyer to talk with, help her have some calmness and a sense of support going through that process. The lawyer was denied entrance to the facility. You have no right to a lawyer when you are in an immigration facility. And so even though we spent all this time and money finding someone to support them, but because their story was strong enough, they were given the permission to be released. And this was right after their family was first reunited after being separated for 2 years. This is not the picture I could find of her ankle monitor, but if you are a man that is released, you have to pay a very substantial bond. Women are given an ankle monitor. But one of the things that people don't realize is, as the person who has to wear the ankle monitor, you are financially responsible for paying the company who monitors your ankle monitor. It also requires you to be home by 8 o'clock at night. English classes in Waukesha go from 6 to 9 p.m., so she couldn't take English classes at WCTC because they would have had her out too late at night. You also, when you first arrive, unless you have a lawyer to help you navigate the system, you are not legally allowed to work or drive. So fortunately, our lawyer was able to help with those things along the way so that she could work. But you're also not eligible for food stamps or any other sort of financial aid. So you really do need to live off of other people when you first arrive here. There was a night within the first probably 2 weeks they were here where her ankle monitor would not charge over a weekend. And there are so many threats that if there's something wrong with your ankle monitor, that you could be deported because they will accuse you of monitoring it, of messing with it. So I was at work at school that afternoon, even though it was a weekend, getting some stuff done. I came home and everyone was in a panic. What do we do? What do we do? So I took pictures of it charged in and the light not working, sent them to our lawyer with a timestamp on it saying, here is proof that we are trying to charge this. You can show that this is the time of date that we have sent this email to you. And I also called our local police station saying, we want you to know that we are reaching out to law enforcement, that we are doing our best in this situation. Can you keep a record that we called you? We tried calling Homeland Security, who's in charge of monitoring it, and no one answered the phone. However, when the battery died at 3:30 in the morning, they were on the phone at 3:31 saying, where are you and what are you doing? And so in that situation, they were very closely monitoring things. When our family was celebrating Christmas Eve at my mother's house, they did one of their random calls to check in, and she said hello, and then they proceeded to reprimand her because they did not like the tone of voice that she used when she said hello, and said that she needed to be more polite with them and friendly to them when they called for their check-ins. She also had frequent check-ins once a month at ICE here in Milwaukee, and about every 2 to 3 months she would have to go to immigration court in Chicago. And this is a 2-year process. And so my dad is retired, so he really took this on, and he made sure that they had rides, because you also aren't allowed to drive, that he was able to drive her to all of her appointments. And so for my dad, that was a really eye-opening experience, because what he was hearing from his friends, what was happening with immigration, what they heard from someone else who heard from someone else, was so different than what he was living day to day. And then on June 2017, my nephew Aparicio was with our church youth group and drowned in a swimming accident. And so this is the funeral procession in El Salvador. His 18th birthday would have been 2 days ago, so this is extra tender for me today. And the terrible irony of what this family went through and everything we did to keep this child safe, and that when he was with the church youth group here in the United States is when he lost his life, was and has been a difficult struggle for our family to accept. But his parents were then forced to deal with this subject. And it, as you know, with Latino culture, Day of the Dead and Day of the Saints, where you go and you visit your loved one's grave and you spend time with them, were faced with this horrible prospect, because they were still going through the process of what country they were going to spend the rest of their life in. If they were deported, they were never going to be allowed back to the United States. If they receive permission to stay, they will lose their residency if they ever return to El Salvador. So they had to decide where to bury their son, knowing that there was a good chance they might not ever be able to visit his grave. And so they decided they were going to send him back to El Salvador. They were not able to travel for his funeral, so my husband and I went representing the role of parents for his funeral there. And so they still have never been able to visit his grave to this day, though they have sent money to make sure he has a beautiful grave. Then if they become citizens, they'll be able to travel. And then on January 29, 2018, they finally had their appointment with the final court, and they were given permanent residency, which was such a beautiful and bittersweet day because Aparicio wasn't here for it, but we knew they were safe. Excuse me for just a moment. We thought the family was out of the woods at that time. My sister-in-law has her green card and her permanent residency, as do the children. The court has not yet, as of today, sent the paperwork to my brother-in-law, Carlos, saying that he has any legal standing in this country. He is still legally not allowed to work. He is still legally not allowed to drive because the paperwork is still being processed 2 years later, after he was given permission to be here. And so their family has scrimped and saved so that they have a down payment for a house, because they know that that's the financially good thing to do for their children. But they're continuing to rent because they don't know what the status is of Carlos, because in this era, anything could happen without him having any paperwork to prove that the court said he could stay. And our lawyer has said at this time it's best not to file any more requests, because it's better that he stays under the radar, because the decision could be reversed since no paperwork was ever issued. And then in March of 2018, my mother-in-law was finally allowed to come here. And so here she is getting to be with her grandchildren. To lighten up the mood a little, couple of funny stories about her first times here. So she was, she arrived I think on a Friday, and then on a Monday, I came home from work, and my husband had been home that day, but his mom and dad were with our 2 kids. No problem, and they were both just sitting on the couch. Even though I speak Spanglish that my husband understands perfectly, his mother thinks that I perhaps speak Portuguese or Italian, because it sounds like nothing like Spanish to her. She has no idea what I'm saying ever. And so I just said, hola, and then I started cooking dinner, and hola, and waved. Then my husband walks in a couple minutes later, and he's like, Mom, what is wrong with you? She said, my son, I have waited 30 years to come and live in the same country as your father, and to be where my sons are, and to see my grandchildren. And now that God has allowed me to see all of you, I think I'm dying. I think this is the end. I feel sick in a way I've never felt before. Well, what happened? Well, I was thirsty, and your dad went downstairs, and there's a small refrigerator there, and he found a strawberry juice and gave it to me, and ever since drinking that strawberry juice. Mom, you're drunk right now. That was a strawberry margarita. And since she had never had a drop of alcohol in her life, and in that part of El Salvador, you're either someone who is an alcoholic or you don't drink at all. Why would her honorable son and her daughter, who is a teacher and they're at the church, why would we have alcohol in our house to even have that be a question? So she recovered from her first hangover successfully. And then later that week, she asked me to read the label on this moisturizer she was using, and I saw her skin. She had chemical burns all over it. And it was an exfoliating body scrub that she thought was lotion, and the drier and more painful her skin got, the more of it she was putting on. I said, just stop using it. Let me get you some soap. Here we go. And just use water to let all these days of exfoliation. So immigration always has its funny stories, as well as you try to balance out life in a new country, because they don't know how to read. And so you balance coming from a house where there's a few extension cords bringing electricity in and outdoor plumbing to all the things that we have here. The dishwasher just blows their minds, and things along those lines. And the hot showers. My husband's first day here, he took 30 minutes in the shower. And I thought, well, we've been at the hospital. He's probably just really tired. And he said, I don't know how to use your shower. He's like, the water was so hot. I just kept jumping in and then jumping out and trying to relax from how hot it was. So then I said, it doesn't have to be all the way to hot. So, and then the other stories that our family's going through, I don't have pictures of, because these are people who are still going through the process. And with their situation still being very delicate, I felt it was best to keep those sort of anonymous out of respect for the process they're going through. One of Edwin's brothers, his name is Jose, and he's been living in Baltimore for a very long time. If you don't know this, the area in Maryland between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. is the #1 place for Salvadorans to go to when they come to the United States. They actually jokingly call it the 15th state of El Salvador, because there's so many Salvadorans that live there. #2 is L.A., but for the most part, almost all of the Salvadorans that I know of that have come here end up in Baltimore. And his family, he was here, he came as a fairly young man, and he left his family back in El Salvador, and they came here and they went through the immigration, the political process, asylum process as well. Unfortunately, they hired a lawyer they found on the radio. And one of the things I've learned to discover is that's become a very predatory process in the Spanish-speaking world right now, is there's lots of people that promote themselves as notaries or immigration lawyers, and they either are qualified, but they take on way too many. The door is a warning to them to turn their daughters over to the gangs, the oldest daughter. But there was, between two different court appearances, there was 2 different stories about which side of the door the dog had been left on. And so because there was that discrepancy in their story, they were given a deportation order. And that's one of the disadvantages to not having a quality lawyer. Our lawyer really worked hard with our family here, Jenny and Carlos, to say, if you're going to give testimony, don't ever tell a story that you don't remember in great detail that might not be consistent. And he spent a lot of time preparing them for the emotional stress of being on the stand. Because when you are someone that has been severely traumatized and you're now in the court system and it's not in your own country, that's a very intense situation. And so because of this lack of preparation is what we believe is what led for some of that indiscrepancy in their story. They were able to file an appeal, but you can only file, when you file the appeal in immigration court, it is not that you get a second chance to make your case and bring new evidence. It is that you say that your lawyer was criminally negligent. And so they were not able to prove that their lawyer was criminally negligent in their case. And so when their appeal was finalized, they were given a deportation order. Their family has decided to move away from Baltimore and just stay living in the shadows, which was really heartbreaking because 2 weeks before this decision was granted, their oldest daughter graduated from high school with honors. And so we had gone out to Baltimore for her graduation, and it was ironic at her graduation party on the front lawn of their apartment complex. My husband knew everybody there. Oh, that person's from 2 streets down in our hometown. That person's from across the street in our hometown. It really was a little microcosm of El Salvador where they all knew each other and felt comfortable, which is good and bad, because when it's all people who don't know how to work the system, advising people how to work the system, that's where some misinformation gets out there. And so now my niece, who had all this promise and worked so hard to graduate from high school with all these dreams of going to college, is working at McDonald's with no foreseeable option for anything else in her life. And she's just saving up so that if she's deported, she has money to live on when she gets to El Salvador. Her younger sister is in middle school in this place where they are currently living, where she dreams of becoming a neurosurgeon. And I don't have the heart to tell her that that is not going to be reality with the way things are at this time, but tell her to just keep working at it, because who knows where things are going to go for them. We had another situation come up with some people from our sister parish in El Salvador. And our relationship is particularly close since my husband worked very much as a youth minister. And there was 2 brothers there who were fluent in English, and every time we'd want to go, they would just want to practice their English. And so many Salvadorans are initially shy when you first meet them, and these 2 young men were not. And the older brother left a message for someone that he was leaving because he couldn't stand the abuse he was getting from the gangs and the threats. He hadn't been able to leave his house in a month, and there was some questions about his sexuality, and it was getting too dangerous for him. And so I think 5 of us called him when he was on the border with Guatemala saying, it's too dangerous, don't go, don't go, don't go. At which point we found out his brother was already here and in Baltimore. And so he said, I have to go because I'm going to be killed if I stay here. He said, I might be killed making the journey. I understand how difficult it is. He said, but at least I have a chance of staying alive. If I stay here, I'm going to be dead in the next 2 months. While he was making this journey, when he was so close to the border, he was traded to a Mexican drug cartel where he was held for an increased ransom. So we worked together to get him saved from that situation. And then he was released to Homeland. Once he got released from them, he was able to turn himself in at the border, where he ended up with Homeland Security. This is now in the Trump era where this was going on. And so their newest strategy has been to move people from immigration center to immigration center. So it's very hard for them to be in touch with people. And so he would be picked up at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, we're moving you. And they wouldn't tell him where they were moving him. He wouldn't know if he was being sent back to El Salvador or being sent to another immigration center somewhere in the United States. So for a while he was in Texas, where we were able to get a sister parish church down there, try to get in to visit him. And he ended up being moved the next day the day before they were going to visit. Then he was in the St. Louis area for quite a while. And then we found out he was being moved to McHenry County in Illinois, which we thought, this is wonderful. This is right across the border. And every single one of these systems is privately run and independent of other ones. And so they all have a different system for making phone calls, because those are all collect calls. And you have to prepay. So we would send to the prison in Texas, we would send $25 so he could call home, use the laundromat to clean his clothes, and have some food to eat. And the money is not refundable always. And then they would ship him to a different detainment center owned by a different company with a different payment system. So we would have to send another $50 or $25, and then he'd be moved to another one. And then when you want to schedule a visit with someone, you have to pay money to make the appointment. So my husband and I, we paid the money to make the appointment to go visit him in McHenry. We drove down. And we were told that their phone system was not working that day because you cannot see someone face to face. You can only speak to them through the phones. And because the phone system was out, we were going to have to leave. And so we made plans to go back the next day. They said, hopefully be up and running by tomorrow. And he was moved at midnight that night when they found out he had visitors. He was going to come and see him. So at that point, he was moved back to St. Louis, and he was in the detention center for 3 months. While all of this 3 months was going on, happened to be the same window of time that we went out for my niece's graduation in Baltimore, which is where his brother was staying with some family members there. And in speaking with his brother, his family were people that he had not met. It was extended family, cousin of a cousin of a cousin, who primarily viewed him as a source of money. They had lent him some of the money for his bail, and they were keeping him working 15 hours a day, charging him rent, charging him for food, and charging him with interest on the money for his bail. And they had said, no, you are not allowed to get a lawyer to file your political asylum papers until you have paid us back the money you owe us. What he didn't, and they said, you've got plenty of time to do it, it doesn't matter, which is not the case. You really need to get in with a lawyer and file that paperwork as soon as you are released from detention. So we were able, with the help from people from a couple of the other churches in the Milwaukee area, to get money to pay off his family. And we ended up driving back with him from Baltimore. We have a RAV4 with a little bumper seat in the back and a seatbelt, so it's a legal seat, but not the most comfortable. But our daughters had the car seats, so they got to go in the seats with legroom. So he had to sit in the back of our little car. Thank goodness for Amazon. We were able to buy a rooftop carrier from Amazon that we had sent to us at the hotel. So we had a place to put all of our suitcases, since he was now sitting essentially in the trunk area of our car to ride back. So that was his arrival to Wisconsin. He got to Wisconsin, and a week later, his brother was finally released. And then they ended up living with a coworker of mine for a while, and now they're on their own. So they are both still going through the process. They are both severely traumatized from everything they've gone through, from the abuse they went through in El Salvador as the gangs were targeting them, especially for their involvement with the church. And then through everything they went through the border crossing, what they went through in Homeland Security, and then now with this constant threat hanging over their minds. So those are the stories of what my last 10 years of immigration have been with. Our law firm has been wonderful to work with. They joke that we are their Waukesha branch of their office because we send them so much business. But immigration is not easy, and these are all people who have tried to do it the right way. And I think that's what's terribly sad about this, is when you apply for political asylum, you are following U.S. immigration law. That is the only way to come here when you're in that situation. If someone is threatening to kill you next week, you can't wait 15 years for your name to be there on that list. And so the system that the U.S. has in place is this process where you have to show up here. And the people who are being deported are the people who have followed the laws, because the U.S. government knows where they are, and those are the ones that are primarily being deported right now. The people who have not gone through this process, who are just living under the radar, it doesn't mean that they're bad people. They are still wonderful, wonderful people. But the irony of our government really primarily going after people who are trying to follow U.S. immigration law is especially frustrating for me as someone who believes in fairness and law and order, being just and doing what's right. And I can tell you that my family members, when they have money, they are spending it in businesses to buy food, to buy clothes, to pay rent. They're working at jobs where there's constantly openings. Our economy is stronger because they are here. They don't receive any handouts, but they are only contributing. So we are all benefiting from them being here. So thank you for your time today. If you have questions, you want to ask now or later, I'm happy to help with that.
Is your mother-in-law still?
So she is going to be coming back shortly. She has decided, since she's got this 10-year green card where she can go back and forth a little bit more, that she's going to spend her winter months in El Salvador. So her business in El Salvador is that she has cows. And she sells milk, and she sells in El Salvador in line, waiting to come.
Well, when she comes back to visit, tell her your friends at St. Matthew's say in the Benitos.
I will be sure to tell her that. Yes.
You said that the people who come have no benefits?
Correct.
I thought that they had access to the school
They have access to school. They can go to school, and they can get, if you are homeless, you can get free lunch. They don't have access to medical care. Any medical care that they've had to pay out of pocket for. They do not have access to food stamps. Yes.
What does your husband think needs to be done in the long run in El Salvador to build a more peaceful community there?
I think one of the big things is just economic development, because the gangs have been an alternative for income, and for in a country that has machismo culture, if the man can't provide for his family, that's a very deflating feel. And that's something that also turns people to the gangs of, if I can't have a job that provides for my family, at least I can be a tough guy by being with the gang. So I think economic development is a big piece. Education is a big piece. He's very optimistic right now with the new president of the changes he's making. My husband disagrees with Bishop Gomez on this. Bishop Gomez is all about peace and forgiveness. My husband is more on the, let's lock all these gangsters up. We're done with them. They've destroyed this country. They can all rot in jail. Because he coming from a peasant family, the bishop is a Nobel Peace Prize runner-up. He lives in his life experiences with the gang violence have not been quite as immediate. He's definitely had to deal with it. But the house where my husband grew up, his family still owns it. And his cousin's boyfriend was shot there a year ago. Someone just came in and shot him while he was sitting there and walked out the door. And so they've really, another cousin, and then he's had 2 cousins murdered in the last year and a half, walking home from church, both of them. But it's a difficult situation. It's still the ripple effects. The Civil War never really truly ended. It just sort of had a different focus now. But I think education and economic development are the 2 really big pieces. Well, I'm here at St. Matt's frequently for the El Salvador and Tanzania meetings. So if you ever have more questions, you can usually find me at those meetings.